friends, I'm Kim Adamski, HIV prevention specialist at the Hartford Gay and Lesbian Health Collective. We're located at 1841 Broad Street in the south end of Hartford. We do HIV testing, STD testing, sexual health. We also have a dental program. We have support groups. We do education, vaccinations, all kinds of fun stuff. So I'll give you some contact information at the end, but today we are live with Tara Lutz. So you may know that it is Autism Acceptance Month, and so Tara is going to talk a little bit about sexual health education and myths and that sort of thing that are associated with the autistic community. So Tara can talk more about this. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and what you do, Tara.
Sure. So, hi everyone, my name is Tara Lutz. I am an assistant professor at UConn School of Medicine, and I am also the training director at UConn's University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, also known as the UCED. So we serve the entire state of Connecticut, in particular those with disabilities and their families, to make sure they can lead full, inclusive, productive lives. I want to thank Kim for this opportunity to participate in this discussion, and I am going to show PowerPoint slides. I don't want this to be super lecture-y, but I think it's really important that I have visual cues for people who are more visual learners. I'm also going to turn on the captioning. It will be live. It is not 100% accurate, but again, this is for accessibility purposes. All right, here we go.
Perfect.
So, title of this talk is Autism and Sexuality, Dispelling Myths and Breaking Down Barriers. So a couple of disclaimers as we get started. I've learned from people much wiser than me to throw out a bunch of these disclaimers up front. If at any time I start talking about sexual behavior, sexual identity, gender identity, anything like that, I'm going to use myself as examples. Don't assume anything about anyone who may or may not consume this content. Also going to take a sex positivity stance, and there will be a slide later on that's going to cover some things that are not so sex positive, but the focus of my interest is really in sex positivity. So that's not to negate the seriousness of negative sexual health outcomes, but that's not going to be the focus of this. I also want to bring a little bit of attention to the language and terminology I'm going to use. And Kim actually already exemplified this. Different communities respond differently to how they'd like to be referred to. In particular with autism, some people prefer person-first language, so it would be a person with autism, while many others prefer identity-first or disability-first language. So that's an autistic person. Finally, abbreviations, alphabet soup. So IDD stands for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, DD stands for Developmental Disabilities, and ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. All right, so I thought to start things off, I'd talk a little bit about how to interact with persons with disabilities in general, and that's often abbreviated PWD. So first and foremost, always want to presume competence. All too often in many arenas of life, be it education, healthcare, community living, persons with disabilities are assumed to not be competent. They're assumed that they don't understand what's being said to them, and everything is really deficits focused rather than strengths based. So always presume competence. You always want to speak directly to the person you're interacting with, not those who are around them, those support staff, direct care persons, family members, anything like that. One of the themes for today is to always be age appropriate. So we always want to treat adults like adults. And if anyone uses any type of assistive technology and or equipment and or service animals, that's not for other people to touch or interact with. Think of those as kind of extensions of a person with a disability, of their body. Always want to be patient with communication. Not everyone communicates verbally, and sometimes those who do need a little extra time to process thoughts and share back. So important to be patient and to not try and finish people's sentences. Quote at the bottom of this slide says, "Not being able to speak is not the same thing as having nothing to say." So those are just kind of really important points to keep in mind throughout this presentation.
So before you continue, can you explain for the benefit of our audience why we say people with disabilities rather than disabled people?
Absolutely, Kim. So I alluded to this earlier. Persons with disabilities or people with disabilities is considered person-first language. Some groups prefer this, like I said, others do not. But what it does is put the emphasis on the person rather than the disability. However, disability is very personal, and so, which is why some people prefer identity or disability first, because they don't like to separate who they are from their disability. So when in doubt, you can ask. Professional literature is actually in an interesting place where there's no right or preferred way. At this point, you're supposed to go with what the people you're talking with prefer and mention that somewhere in your writing. Does that answer your question, Kim?
It sure does. It's kind of like, I mean, we do the same thing at our clinic all the time. And the one that comes to mind is people who inject drugs as opposed to drug users. Obviously a somewhat different situation, but we use person-first language in our intakes as well. So.
All right. Also, as Kim mentioned, April is Autism Acceptance Month. Once upon a time, April was Autism Awareness Month. We have moved past awareness and are focusing on acceptance, because being aware just isn't enough. And to get really nerdy for a second, the recently revised 10 Essential Public Health Services, which is my background, has become much more action oriented. So shout out public health right now. We wanted to share a few stats about autism or autism spectrum disorder. At this point, the median prevalence of autism is about 1 in 54 children. Like I said, that's a median prevalence. It's not a mean. It is right now known to be 4 times more common among boys. And approximately 1.6 million children, apologies, million is missing there, ages 3 to 17 have been diagnosed with a developmental disability, which can include autism spectrum disorder, among others.
So I'm sorry.
No, please.
Oh, so I've read that part of the reason it's so much more common among boys is because the signs of autism are ignored or not like noticed as much in girls.
That is a highly contested thought.
Okay.
Jury's still out on that. We've worked really, really hard in all of the scientific studies to account for that kind of assumption. So at this point, we don't think it's an overprevalence. But on a very related topic, we often see young boys and young boys of color being suspended and expelled from preschools at rates that are disproportionate to other groups. And there is literature to support that. It's because preschool teachers have a tendency to look for problem behaviors, not equitably, if that makes sense. So there may be a little bit of that going on, but I don't think that the 4 times more common is too far off, if that makes sense.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Absolutely. So the last thing I've included on this slide is a link to Learn the Signs Act Early. It's a CDC campaign that is really useful for parents, caregivers, educators, and providers. It actually walks individuals through developmentally the milestones that a young child should meet, and if they are not meeting them, the steps that people can take to kind of address what's going on. Because the earlier we act and intervene, we know the potential for really positive outcomes, including successful, happy lives, is greater. All right, so a little bit more about ASD, autism spectrum disorder. People who have been diagnosed with ASD often like to be referred to as neurodiverse and or neurodivergent or a neurominority, which really just means that their brains are different. So it's a flip on the traditional terminology, and it's actually really interesting. A lot of people do not agree with a clinical diagnosis. So this is one way that we're kind of moving away from that really medical clinical space to talk about neurodiversity. And lots of people with ASD are neurodiverse in the ways that they self-regulate, the ways that they communicate, their social skills, how they pay attention to things, things like that. Other few things to note: a clinical diagnosis is made through observations. There's no blood test or any other type of test we can do. It's by observation. And a clinical diagnosis is not the same thing as educational eligibility. So children can receive special education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act under 13 categories, of which autism is one. Finally, along the lines of being neurodiverse, and I'm not really going to go over the symptomatology or the shared common characteristics among persons with autism or autistic people. So if you've met one person with ASD or one autistic person, you've met one person. Really speaks to the variability within the label. A couple thought questions. If this was a different type of format, we'd actually spend some time breaking this down. But off the bat, did you ever receive sex education or family life education, as it's known in Connecticut? If so, from where? Most of us get it from some of these places, hopefully some, if not all or none at all. These include parents and family, school, friends, faith religious groups, social media, and other places as well.
I never knew that they called it family life education in Connecticut. That seems like it doesn't really comprehensively encompass the subject.
It certainly does not, and spoiler alert, we're going to get to that in a little bit.
Okay, great.
Some other things to think about: what were some of those first messages you received about sex, sexuality, and sexual health? What topics were covered and what wasn't? And was what you learned inclusive? I bet it was not inclusive. All right, a little bit more diving into sex and autism spectrum disorder. So this shouldn't be surprising. Adolescents with ASD enter puberty at about the same time as their typically developing peers. They're interested in and are engaging in sexual behaviors at similar rates to their neurotypical or typical developing peers. And the individual experience of autism can have a unique and direct impact on social interactions and experiences of sexuality. Unfortunately, people with ASD are more likely to have not received any type of sex education compared to those without ASD. If it's provided, it's done so in a reactive way, usually about an inappropriate behavior. For example, an autistic boy is caught masturbating in class, and instead of explaining that there's a time and a place for that and self-love is wonderful, it's very much downplayed, like, no, that's nothing you should be doing ever at any time, and no real explanation to it. Also, sometimes sex education is provided out of fear of and for victimization and or exploitation. Unfortunately, persons with disabilities are at a much higher risk of experiencing some sort of sexual assault or sexual exploitation. However, receiving sex ed is one example of how we can enhance and promote self-determination, which I would encourage you all to look up what that is. It is a really big deal in the disability world. Self-determination and self-advocacy are really important key skills to living successful, interdependent lives in the community. So what does this look like in terms of sexual health care? Persons with disabilities, in particular autism, are less likely to be up to date with screenings, like your mammogram, your pap smear, things like that. Less likely to be asked about sexual activity in any type of healthcare encounter. So they're less likely to be treated for STIs. And some of the reasons why these things exist, there's issues with attitudes from providers and assumptions about sexual behavior, and persons with disabilities, very difficult to get an appointment, right? There's insurance issues, there's transportation issues. If I get an appointment, is the space I'm going to able to accommodate me? Is it accessible? Does the space I'm going to have equipment that's going to work for my body? Wait times are often very difficult, sometimes tied to transportation. Persons with disabilities often rely on public transit and or transportation such as dial-a-ride, where our schedules are not our own. So if my driver shows up 10 minutes early and I'm not done, I need to leave or I will no longer have a ride home. And sometimes these services are unreliable. And now during COVID, it's even more of an issue. All right, getting into a little bit about the world of individuals who identify as LGBTQ plus and autism. So sometimes persons who identify in both of these spaces refer to it as a double rainbow, which I think is actually really cool.
I like that too.
And some of the literature speculates that there's actually a higher prevalence within persons with autism who identify in the LGBTQ community compared to those without ASD, which is interesting. I think personally it's a little early to start making those types of claims, but it's at least really interesting to think about.
Anecdotally, I can say that, so our organization's on TikTok, and the younger generation who we know is more openly identifying as LGBTQ, there's like a big autistic LGBTQ like TikTok community. So if any teenagers are watching that, hit that up, but be safe because it's TikTok.
So a few things I want to touch on that are not so great. So individuals who identify in both of these spaces, right, experience intersectionality, and kind of a double intersectionality because they're part of two non-majority groups that experience marginalization. So of the literature that's out there for people who identify in both of these spaces, we know that they have poor experiences with healthcare, including finding a provider or being refused to be seen by a provider, or not being respected by a provider and or the overall healthcare system that they're working in. They report having worse overall health, and in general, their needs are less likely to be met by providers than those who don't identify in this double rainbow space. So lots of work to be done, lots of advocacy. We're going to get into that in a little bit. I posted on this slide 3 resources. These are by no means exhaustive, but check these spaces out to learn a little bit more about the double rainbow space. All right, now finally getting into barriers to sex and sex ed. There are a bunch in large categories. We've got myths, we've got attitudinal barriers, structural barriers. I've got transportation here starred. This was actually, I was called out in a previous presentation by a disability advocate, so a person with a disability themselves. I was talking a similar talk, and he wanted to make sure that transportation as a barrier was talked about. As I said earlier, lots of people with disabilities utilize either public transit or apps such as Uber or Lyft to get around, or rely on friends who have licenses. So this individual was explaining to me he was going on a date, and the person he was going on a date with didn't drive, and he didn't drive. So how are they supposed to meet up? And now with COVID and all of the restrictions, though they are being lessened, it's just another step for people to have to consider should they want to gather either socially or romantically, sexually.
Yeah, I was thinking particularly what you said about COVID with transportation, because I mean, I like to use public transit sometimes when it's convenient, but like I haven't been able to like safely because of COVID, and I can't imagine if that was my only way to get places. I'd have to choose between getting the care or whatever I needed and the risk of COVID on a bus.
We'll take a 30-second detour, just why when we first set up COVID testing sites in the state, we didn't do a great job placing those testing sites on bus routes for people who could not access testing in any other way. All right, we'll talk briefly about policy and then a little bit about accessibility and comprehensiveness of curriculum. Common myths. All right, and I have heard all of these more than once. So lots of people think that autistic people, people with disabilities are asexual. It's just sex is not a thing. It's not on their radar. It's not part of who they are. Just not there. Move on. Others feel that we need to protect individuals with disabilities and autism. And by doing that, we're restricting and inhibiting their sexuality. They can't learn about this. They can't engage in this because they don't know what they're doing. They're going to be exploited. Also thoughts that should we teach persons with autism, autistic people about sex, they're going to engage in more inappropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior in general. And who's to say what inappropriate behavior is? Some people believe that people with disabilities should be sterilized so that they do not give birth to another generation of persons with disabilities. Citation there, Buck v. Bell, is a Supreme Court case. Look it up. Others believe that persons with disabilities are predisposed to engage in unusual or sexually deviant behaviors. So by not teaching them about sex, we're not going to have problems down the road. Similarly, some believe that persons with disabilities will become dangerous if they know about sex. And others believe that they're unable to benefit from sexual counseling or treatment should something not so great happen to them. All right, so educator and provider barriers. More often than not, people who get uncomfortable don't talk about sex. I'm fortunate to be among peers, colleagues who don't feel that discomfort, but that's not to say that professionals across the board are comfortable talking about sex, especially talking about sex with persons with disabilities. So what happens? We just don't talk about it. There's also an assumption that someone else is going to take care of it. Families think the school will do it. School thinks the healthcare provider is going to do it. So we just end up pointing fingers at each other. Others assume it's just not applicable. Like, that's not going to be part of my child's life, so we don't need to do it. And finally, there is a huge lack of training for educators and providers. So when I say educators, I mean health educators in schools, special educators, and then any type of healthcare provider. And these trainings really need to include meaningful interactions with persons with disabilities, because we know from the literature that a lot of professionals are just uncomfortable. They don't know what to say or do. They forget that people with disabilities are people first and foremost. So a big suggestion is to make sure that the training includes working with persons with disabilities.
I've noticed that providers who are able to competently work with people with disabilities, as well as LGBTQ folks and other minorities, actually sought out that training by themselves, which is not great because these are regular people who go to regular doctors all the time.
Mm-hmm. That happens a lot. There's a lot of self-selection going on. And there's also a lot of word of mouth that happens, which is really positive and great for people to get the care that they need. But then we get providers who are known in certain communities and are completely overwhelmed with patient populations, which doesn't need to happen if we were better at providing training. All right, what about parents, caregivers, and families? So if a child has a disability, whether it be autism or something else, parents tend to be the primary, if not sole, educators for their children about sexuality. And I know from my own research, as well as the literature, that parents overwhelmingly want to talk to their children about sex, especially their children with autism, but they don't know how to start, they don't know where to start, they don't know what to say. So they're craving resources and resourceful people, individuals, educators who can help them do their job as a parent or a caregiver, to be that person for their child. All right, what about the media? This could be an entirely separate talk altogether, but if we start to think about how persons with disabilities are displayed in the media on TV, what does that look like? Are they ever in romantic relationships, in sexual relationships, in diverse relationships? And overwhelmingly no. We're getting a little bit better, but even particularly the TV shows that are out there still really focus on a lot of the stereotypes that we assume about us, but in particular persons with autism. I have 3 points listed on this slide. Often there's a feel-good story at the end of a news cycle about a person with a disability and a person without one that perpetuates the idea that persons with disabilities need people to look out for them, and they should be inspirational, feel-good stories, and that's just not right. They're just people like everyone else. Often they're in TV portrayed as a very awkward story, where they have issues in, say, social interactions, and that's really played up on TV. So whether or not that's entirely accurate, we're a little bit playing into the stereotype. While at the same time, it's great that we're putting this out on mainstream media. We just need to be really careful about how we do it, because we should all be able to watch TV, movies, TikTok, and see people who look like us. And that's not always the case. And if we want to talk about people who live in that double rainbow space, that's really not the case right now.
Right.
All right, we're getting into policies now, Kim. Here we go. So there's no federal mandate out there about sex ed. Everything is up to the states. And within that, it's up to local boards of education. So they set the sex ed curriculum. And sex ed in quotations, we're going to talk about what that actually means.
I mean, there's 5 states, I think it's 5, that ban LGBTQ related sex education. So that's saying something.
It's a thing. It's a really scary thing. So this is an infographic pulled from, it's accurate as of April 9th. So I never know how to pronounce it. It's either Guttmacher or Guttmacher. They do a policy analysis every month about what's going on. So here's what has to happen in Connecticut. It's highlighted in yellow. So we have no sex education mandate. We do have an HIV education mandate. However, it does not need to be medically accurate, age appropriate, culturally appropriate, and unbiased. It cannot promote religion. And we have the option, parents can opt their children out of what's known as HIV education. And should a school district venture into sex education, that's family life education here in Connecticut.
So I actually have a funny anecdote about the HIV education in Connecticut. My cousin learned about HIV in elementary school and learned, that blood to blood contact led to HIV transmission, but they didn't really explain it very well or explain that it was needles, sexual contact, etc. So she went home crying because she was afraid that she'd get a cut on the playground and then her cut would touch another kid's cut and then she would get HIV from them. And my aunt had to call the school and be like, can you please explain to Becca the truth here so she's not freaking out? She doesn't believe me. So that was a fun one.
And there are so many stories like that, and so many stories that kids don't even get that much information, which is really scary. If you were to look at this chart that shows all of the states, there's a lot of strange things going on in this country that has been decided by state governments, and then it's up to, like I said, local boards of education to make decisions from there. A lot of work to be done. All right, so what else can be considered a barrier? So is the curriculum accessible? So is it available in other formats? Is it available with large font, for example? Do images have alternate text? So this PowerPoint, should anyone access it, is fully accessible. And I tried my best to use plain language and not a ton of jargon, but that's another accessibility standard that we should all be striving towards. Right? Is the curriculum comprehensive? Does it include diversity? And is it up to date? Likely, not all of these things are happening, if they're happening at all. So at this point, like I said, I wasn't going to live in the sexually negative, if you will, space, but I do feel it's important to mention. So NPR did a special series about what they called an epidemic of sexual assault among adults with intellectual disability. It's a very difficult 4-part piece to listen to. So if that would be really challenging for you, I do not recommend it. It was very hard myself to listen to it, but I thought it was really important that I did. So persons with intellectual disability, autism can fall into that category, are sexually assaulted at a rate at least 7 times higher than persons without disabilities. And this is partly due or assumed to be due to the fact that those with intellectual disability may be easily manipulated, and they have a very difficult time testifying. And what's really sad and comes through in this special series is that they have difficulty testifying because they don't have the language to describe what happened to them. They don't even have the language to describe the parts of their body that were involved. Just really terrible. And again, that's not why we should teach sex ed to people with intellectual disabilities. That's not the sole reason, but unfortunately that needs to be part of the reason. All right, so what can we do? We want to interact with everyone in inclusive ways. All right, we want to address people in the ways they want to be addressed. If we don't know, we want to ask. We want to provide accommodations and accessibility wherever we can. We need to get informed about state and local policies. So the link provided, you can check in on what's going on at a state level. And then I also would encourage anyone to get to know your local Board of Education. It is well within your rights to ask to see the curriculum. So in the state of Connecticut, like I said, HIV education is required and human growth and development is required. Anything beyond that in the family life education space is not required. What is written into statute was that a guidelines had to be developed, or recommendations should a district want to pursue this, but it is not required by anyone. We encourage everybody to get educated and stay educated. Right? Things change all the time. Language and terminology change. We need to do our best to stay on top of what's going on and how people are reacting to things. We want to use inclusive language whenever we can. We want to communicate in accessible ways. For instance, the live captioning going on right now, it's not 100% accurate, but it's doing its best to make sure that those who may be interested or may need it can follow along. And then we want to advocate for so many different things. We want comprehensive, accessible sex education. We want healthcare provider training, especially in this area. We want inclusive depictions of diversity in the media and in our education. We want people to get educated, and we really want our communities to become more accessible. Until you start looking for all the ways in which people are systematically or structurally excluded, the more frustrated it can be. So it really needs to become everyone's responsibility to make sure everyone has access. At this point, I just list a whole bunch of different resources. Kim can capture these and provide them again. Some of these are sex ed related, some are sex ed and disability related. Again, not comprehensive, but really good places to check out. And I close with a list of accessibility resources. I know not everyone is really familiar with how to make documents and products and digital web space accessible, but that's a skill that we all need to get better at. So I've provided these resources, and then I close with a quote from one of the many textbooks that I now own on this topic. So the very best sexual education at home and in schools is not about prevention, but about creation. Its purpose is to teach young people how to create for themselves enjoyable, caring, and responsible adult lives.
Awesome. So I have a question. Do you have any recommended reading for the layperson, such as myself?
Recommended reading. Oh, what a good question. I guess what do you actually like? Do you mean like a textbook?
So
like
I was thinking for like parents and loved ones of folks with autism about sex ed. One of the books that I've read specifically about parents teaching sex ed, when you were saying that parents don't know how to approach it, is Come to Me First. And I really liked that, but it doesn't specifically go into folks with disabilities or anything like that.
And that's often what I've found. I'm actually very familiar with the book you're referring to. And a lot of it is still really applicable. It's just we need to get a little bit better about bridging that gap. You would ask me a question and I'm not in my office where I can pull things off shelves to show you. What I can say in terms of actual curricula, which there are financial barriers associated with accessing it. What's come out of Planned Parenthood is a really good validated curriculum for individuals with developmental disabilities. Oak Hill here in Connecticut is a huge, huge resource. They put on all sorts of different trainings, both for individuals with disabilities themselves, parents, really anyone who wants to be part of it.
Yeah, we know them.
In their Center for Sexuality and Relationship Education. I might have flipped that.
Oh, Jolene just said Advocates for Youth. I know about them. I like them.
Absolutely. They were on my laundry list of
Yeah,
resources.
I saw you had Go Ask Alice too. I love Go Ask Alice.
Mm-hmm.
They're great. The website, not the book.
So a lot of what we also need to get better at is, right, there are so many different sex ed curricula out there. We don't need to continue to reinvent the wheel. We just need to make what we have accessible to people. It needs to be palatable, it needs to be understandable, and we need to figure out what our outcomes should be, right? So, and I've been asked the question several times, like, well, Tara, why don't you write your own curriculum? And I don't think that's the answer. We've got so much already out there. We just need to make it better, and just people just don't have the skill set or don't think about needing to make it better for a number of different reasons. Going back to, right, treat adults like adults. We want to teach people, no matter their ability or disability, age appropriate information, not what's considered developmentally appropriate. And that can be really challenging for professionals.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Well, thank you so much for all of this. This has been really, I learned some new information. It's been really helpful. So I am going to provide the contact info for myself and Health Collective. I know you're talking about difficulty accessing care that is not judgmental, etc. And we do offer a lot of those sexual health services at our clinic. You know, we are affirming, welcoming, etc. of folks with all different ability levels and sexual identities. I just got distracted by a chat, by the way, from Jolene. For disability justice, not sex ed specific, sins invalid, sins invalid is great. Let's hear about that. Did you read that, Tara?
I cannot say that I can.
Jolene, do you want to pop in and talk about it?
I just want to mention it's a disability framework that was put together by a lot of different people who identify in different ways. And so I just wanted to put that into the space. Like there's BIPOC identified individuals, there's queer identified individuals, and they work together. So it's just something for folks to also look at when it comes to social justice, because I think, I dare say that Tara's presentation is a lot about social justice in many ways, in addition to the sex ed piece, right? And so how we treat people, and we don't have justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that I'm learning about it and I'm really excited, and I just wanted to share it. And it's a .org in case people are looking it up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, it's I mean, we should all be learning all the time. So definitely use some of these resources, even if you don't have a family member or anything with disabilities. It's good to know this, because I mean, at some point you're gonna meet somebody with disabilities, and it's good to know about accessibility and all the things Tara talked about. So Our clinic number is 860-278-4163. If you have a question for me, my extension is 111. My email is kim@hglhc.org. Tara, do you have any contact info that you can provide for folks who have questions?
Sure. I took the slide down too quickly. My email is Lutz, so it's LUTZ @uchc.edu.
All right,
You
and
can
I'll put
also-
that in. I'll put that in like text over you so people can see it.
You can also get in touch with Kim. She knows how to find me.
I sure do. All right, thank you so much. This has been really awesome, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do a live presentation for us at HGLHC.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, have a great night.
Yeah.